Okay, welcome back. This is the second part of our discussion about shape, where we're going to actually get more specific about negative space. I got cut off right at the end of the last lecture where I was talking about these two pieces. The program that I use for these videos cuts me off at 10 minutes, so I just wanted to say one more thing about them. I want you to really notice how how conscious Diebenkorn here is about the shapes that he's constructing this painting out of, and how much he makes you think about it. It is a painting of a woman sitting in a chair. She's probably outside. She's probably got a lot of sun on her. She's wearing a hat that probably indicates that. She's got a drink. You can see all of these things, but really what you see is this organization of shapes, that this is a different color from that, this is a different color from that, and a lot of this shape organization is very grid-based, and then the figure is organized as a diagonal that it goes across the grid, but the figure herself is also organized as shapes. Okay, so that sets us up for now to talk about negative and positive shapes. So one of the most important ideas in design, or in one of the principles of organizing design, is the concept of figure-ground relationships, which we often call positive and negative shapes. So we're going to talk about that. And so one of the main things, though, that I want you to understand is that it is not just, oftentimes when we talk about figure-ground, let's go on, like we often will think it's really, see this Escher? The figure-ground is a issue for illusions like this. But the most important thing I want you to understand is that figure-ground is there for any kind of imagery. Whatever kind of painting or photography or printmaking or drawing that you do, you're going to create figure-ground relationships. Sometimes they're just more obvious or more self-conscious than others. Okay, mostly we're going to talk about the very obvious and self-conscious ones for this purpose of this lecture. Okay, so we're on the topic of figure-ground precisely because we were talking earlier about Greek ceramics, and we were talking about then that transition from black figure to red figure, and how to make that transition, the artists who made these vessels had to become much more conscious about negative space. Notice on this one, by the way, this little detail, I love this, of her dress coming up and over, breaking the boundary, and it's coming over the decorative pattern. What a beautiful thought that was. So here are some different kinds of examples of thinking about positive and negative shape, such as the Escher is probably the most obvious example, where the light, as it shifts down, becomes more and more positive, more and more an actual thing, and then the dark is the negative space here, but as it shifts upwards it becomes geese, and the geese become these positive things. And this is what is known as a figure-ground reversal, where you make a work of art where what is positive in one part then becomes negative, and vice versa. But we can see a very conscious thought about figure-ground relationships here in this Sung Dynasty painting, and we can also see it here in the design of the FedEx logo. Some of you, usually in class what I do is I say, okay, raise your hand, all of you who see the hidden arrow in the FedEx logo. And usually there's about maybe 5 people in the class who raise their hand, and everyone else looks at me like, what is he talking about? And then I point out that if you look at this negative space between the E and the X, we have a perfect, very regularly drawn arrow that says, hey, we deliver. And then there's gasps, and people are like, I looked at that my whole life and I never noticed that, as a fun thing about design. So thinking about positive and negative shapes is something that we see a lot of in design, in graphic design, and in illustration. Here are 2 examples of people who were making kind of concept art illustration for different kinds of things. This was for a cover for a Batman story. And this was actually for, this Pixar piece was not made for the movie, but was rather made for Pixar to roll out the movie at Comic-Con, and they hired a series of illustrators to make illustrations based on it. And I love this idea, right, of her hair, right, being positive, but then creating, and then becoming negative space and creating the shape of the bear's head. So as I was doing research about 4 years ago on thinking about positive and negative shapes, this one illustrator slash designer kept popping up this man named Tanya Wong, and he's a graphic designer. And when he first got out of art school, he struggled trying to get work, and so he started to make these pieces as a form of advertising himself. And as he made more and more of these kind of illustrative pieces that play on design concepts, he found that the design concepts that he really enjoyed playing with the most were figure ground design concepts. And he's become sort of like synonymous with really clever plays with figure ground relationships. So you notice in all of these, what appears to be negative space then becomes positive, right? So that the trees then become the dark lines between the pages of the books. Or, that this is all negative space, but then inside the feather itself becomes negative space, and the birds hanging on each branch become positive. But there are other ways to play with negative space shape. Ellsworth Kelly was a painter, painting in the 50s and 60s primarily, although, actually been painting since the 50s. But in his work, it was a major component of his interest in work was looking at shape and looking at especially negative space shapes. He spent a lot of his time drawing, right? And we've already seen one example of his drawings. But when you look at this drawing, one of the things you might not notice is this shape in here, this shape that is created by the empty negative space. And that was the kind of thing that Ellsworth Kelly was very interested in. And he started thinking about finding those kind of shapes and making paintings that were all about just highlighting a single moment of finding a shape. And that's what these kind of like shaped canvas pieces are about. That's probably where we should end before I get to positive and negative space part 2. Okay.